The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We are Baton Rouge Community Radio's only live call-in show. Yes, you can call in, and you are encouraged to do so. 343-9927. We would enjoy hearing your thoughts and questions on the topic of the night. The only rule for calling in is that we be respectful and voice our opinions as such. Remembering that none of us knows everything about anything. Tonight's topic is called redlining. It's a topic of the policy of redlining, which, based upon the many problems that have finally, or once again, risen to the surface here in Baton Rouge concerning the racial divide, has come out and needs to be talked about some more. With me tonight is a co-host and friend, Salvatore. I thank you.
Good evening.
And our special guest, Bobby Thompson, who is here to help Salvatore and me learn more about these issues. How you doing, Bobby?
Doing well, Wade. How are you?
I'm doing just great, and as always, it's glad to have you here. Oh, it's my pleasure, and it's to the benefit of everyone, I think. Anyway.
Before we go on, just
Sure.
let me say I'm a trained facilitator for Dialogue on Race Louisiana, so that's where I pretty much work from.
Okay, you work with that, but you've experienced a lot of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, probably, right?
Somewhat, yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, again, I've attended Dialogue on Race, and for the benefit of the listeners, it's very beneficial. At 56, 57 years old, I learned a lot of things about race relations and our history in this country of institutional racism that I had never known before, never was aware of. And it fascinated me and shocked me and made me really appreciate how deep the problem is.
I've attended it as well, and it really was eye-opening. My favorite word to use is visceral. It really can kick you right in the gut sometimes when you realize the history of institutional racism in America.
Yeah, no, and there's so many things we could talk about. I don't want to get sidetracked, at least not yet. But I do want to talk about redlining, and I'm not going to go into detail now unless it comes up in the show, Bobby, but in getting ready for this topic tonight, I began doing some research and discovered that there is a long chain of policies or lack of laws that have deliberately kept black Americans from advancing economically in this country. I mean, a lot of the time we talk about, discrimination and things like that, but there are far deeper, far more nefarious programs that have been in place. But the big thing, Bobby, as I understand it, with redlining is this was the first time all of these different kind of informal institutions, so to speak, or localized institutions were encapsulated into a federal policy, were they not?
Well, yes, and I think it was 1938 that the FHA was formed to help Americans to own their own property. Before then, I think you had to put down 50% of the cost of the house, and you may have had 5 to 10 years to pay it off.
Through private banks.
Through private banks, right. And which would have excluded a lot of Americans out of the housing market. And it was after it didn't really get rolling until after World War II, when we had all the veterans returning from the wars. And of course, they're looking for housing, and the government wanted to do something to facilitate their, being able to settle.
Right.
So they came up with the Federal Housing Authority as well as the VA loans.
Right, and they would back loans. They would insure loans.
They would insure the loans. It would go through a private bank, and the government would put their guarantee that the loan would be paid regardless of what would happen.
Okay.
So it made it easier for banks to lend money, and it made it easier for the citizens to borrow the money.
Right, but for go ahead.
Well, and the problem was that certain Americans were deliberately excluded from that program. That's absolutely right. I think several studies have showed that only about 2%, maybe 2.5% of the monies, the billions of dollars that were lent went to non-whites.
Okay, and I'm looking at just one of many, an excerpt from an article from the May 22nd, 2004 edition of Atlantic Monthly. This is by Alexis C. Madrigal. It is titled "The Racist Housing Policy That Made Your Neighborhood." And he explains the different ways or different categories that the FHA created for loans.
Mm-hmm.
And they were classified as A, which was the best, green, and then D was red, the worst. And for the yellow, this is what the yellow category was described as. Yellow areas are characterized by age, I guess if older people, and obsolescence, the new technologies in building, I guess, and change of style, expiring restrictions or lack of them. I want to come back to that. Infiltration of a lower grade population, the presence of influences which increase sales resistance, such as inadequate transportation, insufficient utilities, perhaps heavy tax burdens, poor maintenance of homes, etc. Just to start with the lighter one, poor utilities, insufficient utilities, inadequate transportation. That kind of defines a certain section of Baton Rouge, is it not?
Absolutely. It's interesting you should bring that up because I can remember my father and grandfather and uncle talking about when they were purchasing our home that you should always buy, for black people, buy in a cusp neighborhood. In other words, get as close to the white neighborhood as you can. That way you would get services.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And other things here, the restrictions. I don't know that I want to search for it now, but it was said in one of the other articles that the term restrictions, expiring restrictions, was known to apply specifically to race.
Absolutely.
And that got me digging because I thought, well, no, how do you know that? I mean, there are restrictions about putting up signs, your political signs in your yard and stuff like that, and that's what I was thinking of.
You can't have a fence so many, 3
Right.
feet tall,
Exactly,
or
right.
so close to the sidewalk.
Or build a ramshackle storage shed in your backyard or whatever that looks bad and all that.
Yeah, I don't
But-
think that's what they were talking about.
Well, I wasn't sure, and wanting to address this as objectively as possible, plus knowing that a lot of white people would hear that and say, well, you don't know that for sure. I began looking deeper, and sure enough, for a long time, once slavery was ended and once, at least, I guess, some laws began, well, no, never mind, there were never, as far as I know, protecting blacks against having their land stolen or being tricked out of it.
No.
But there were city ordinances that would specify certain areas of the city where only white people could live. And these were in the law, in the city ordinances. And they were called restrictions, racial restrictions or whatever. And, of course, when they got shot down by the Supreme Court, they came up with the racial... I got it here somewhere.
The covenants?
The covenants, the racial
Covenants.
covenants, yes, where if you sign a deed to buy a house, it says in the deed that I, so-and-so,
You can't sell.
purchase this property under the condition that I will not sell it to a non-white. And the ones that I read also included Jews in that too. But, I mean, there it is right there. And so then the FHA comes along and says, okay, well, anything that doesn't have restrictions anymore, and we got to wonder, what does that mean, really?
Right.
You know?
Right.
I mean, that just. But here again, most people today, and I suspect a lot of black people too, aren't aware of that. They would think, well, it's totally reasonable to have some restrictions,
Yes, of course. And I had always heard of redlining, and I just thought that it kind of only restricted black people to a certain part of town. But what it also meant was that you could not get a mortgage, or you couldn't get mortgage at the rates that whites were getting. So that left black people vulnerable to what's known as contract
mortgages.
mortgages.
Yeah.
There you go.
We'll help each other.
They
with
weren't
our-
really they weren't really mortgages in that you didn't own that house. When you get a regular mortgage, the bank holds the deed to your home, but it's in your name, and when you pay it off, you get that.
Yeah.
Right. And in the meantime, while you're paying on that house, you are accruing equity.
Right.
Yep.
In a contract loan, you get no equity.
Right. I was going to say, before you jumped into that part of it, of the contract loans, by accumulating equity, if you can't make the payments, you default on your loan.
Oh.
The bank sells the house and pays you back your equity.
Right.
But in a contract mortgage, you
No.
you could pay for 20 or 10 years or whatever, have it almost paid off, lose your job, default, and they take the house and all your money too. Huh?
Well, from what I understand, the home was usually owned by someone else who was paying it off and kind of subleasing or subletting it to the black family. The black family was responsible for all the upkeep on the house. You know, if something broke, they were responsible for fixing it. But while they were doing that, they weren't getting any equity. I mean, I have a house, I'm paying on it. The water heater breaks, I fix it, but then, I reap the reward for it in this case. And it kind of blew my mind because we've heard of the subprime predatory practices, back in the early 2000s with what happened there. But, I mean, that was just a continuation of of historical practices that have targeted black Americans, and it's not not right.
I want to come back to the water heater breaking in a moment. Okay, I want to remind the listeners you're listening to A Pause for Thought. We're discussing redlining with Bobby Thompson and Salvatore. You can call in with your thoughts and questions at 343-9927, 343-9927. And we never really talked about where the term redlining came from. Can we make clear that first?
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on it, Wayne. There were four categories of property value. And like you said, number one was your pristine, new neighborhood that was with new homes, white population.
White people.
Right, exactly. Then you had the two was a blue blue color, and it was a rating that was older neighborhood, but still primarily white. Then you get to the three, which is yellow, and that's kind of where they're older and it's starting to change.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or you could get that designation only if it's starting to change.
Right, but they would circle on a map.
They would circle
that
it on.
area
They would actually color it
with a red line.
They
Yeah.
would color it in.
And you could not get an FHA loan in that area.
That's
Okay.
the point.
Here's another point, getting back to the water heater. Okay, here's an actual story in an Atlantic Monthly article, a different one, where a black man was able to get into a neighborhood that was deliberately recruiting Jewish people and non-whites to help promote segregation. And
Segregation or desegregation?
Oh, I'm sorry, to desegregation, excuse me. Thank you. And and he apparently had one of those mortgages, the contract mortgages, I guess, but his water heater broke.
Yeah.
And, of course, since he's buying the house, it's his responsibility to fix it. But he couldn't get a loan to pay for it.
Right.
And something else I've read, too, is it's not just mortgages, it's home upkeep, home improvements. You can't get loans in those neighborhoods, so the property is guaranteed to decline if you can't afford to keep it up.
Absolutely. Redlining really explains why our neighborhoods look the way they do. There's a wonderful and there's a wonderful book by a woman, Beryl Salters, who wrote the book Family Properties, and she was the daughter of a lawyer, civil rights lawyer, who fought contract lending and redlining pretty much most of his career, which culminated in getting some relief for the residents in 1975. What I'm saying is Chicago is a perfect example of what the rest of the country looked like, because it was like the epicenter of redlining, where the city actually enforced these regulations. There's another story in that where the neighbors rioted when a black family moved in, set the house on fire, injured the people that were in, and when the police came, they did not arrest the rioters. They arrested the homeowner, they arrested whoever the person was that owned the building, and charged them with destroying the property values of the people in the neighborhood.
Oh, wonderful. They weren't even bashful enough to be discreet.
Not at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, one of the articles I read in a similar way, even when black people or Jews were able to move into one of these neighborhoods, suddenly they'd find they couldn't get the utilities hooked up. They couldn't get any help at all, and it was just they were harassed by the people in the area, simply not cooperating with them.
Yeah.
But the main legacy of redlining is, we kind of touched on it, that if you buy a traditional mortgage, you gain equity, and over a period of time, the house is going to need maintenance. So you can always take out, cash in some of your equity, and
Yep.
build your house up and do renovations, or you can use that money to send your kids to college or open a business. Different ways that you could use that equity to improve your life.
But-
Was it with the FHA loans, the way that the middle class transfers wealth in this country is through home ownership. The house. I think we touched on this a couple weeks ago at the roundtable we had. I go buy a house, or see my parents buy a house for $50,000 in 1970, and now it's worth $250,000. They sell it. That wealth gets passed on to me and to my brother. With the redlining, where the people couldn't get loans for home improvement or to make maintenance or anything like that. I mean, we guaranteed that those home values would fall, thus denying the ability for the people in those districts or in those areas, black Americans, to transfer wealth. And there have been studies where the wealth gap between black families and white families is amazing, and it's mainly because of the home ownership issues.
Over the generations,
Yeah.
white people have been able to accumulate property simply by parents passing inheritances on and everything, and gradually different generations accumulate more and more wealth. But from the get-go, blacks have been prevented from owning and accumulating property.
Absolutely.
I mean, when you could buy it on your own, it was stolen from you, or you were tricked out of it, or whatever.
Or even today, because of redlining and the legacy of redlining, black property is still not worth
Oh no.
what white property is. My mom just died, which was my dad had died earlier, and we inherited her house, which was a large 4-bedroom, 2-bath, beautiful home
Nice.
in a very nice neighborhood. But because it was a mixed neighborhood, and I'm not saying because it was a mixed neighborhood, but the property value was, if that home had been 5 blocks west, it would have been worth almost $100,000 more than we were able to sell it.
Because it was on the other side of the color line.
It
really,
was on the other side of the
map.
cut line,
On the map,
and
yeah.
it was primarily a mixed neighborhood, meaning that it was at least 50% black. Was the reason for the lowering it.
And you just reminded me of something, Bobby. When I was growing up in New Jersey, I was in a small town right across the Delaware River from Philadelphia, and we had the black section of town, And my friends and I would go down there, ride our bicycles down through it and all that frequently, and there was no crime. They were our friends. We went to school with them and all that, but I couldn't help but noticing that all the houses and everything were basically older and kind of run down, not kept up. So people can't use the excuse that, well, these are high crime neighborhoods and everything else. That's why nobody wants to live there, because back then there was none. We were all friends. Everybody got along. They didn't have the drug problems we do now, but yet we still had the problems with the properties.
And what that creates is a true ghetto. And a ghetto is a place that you're locked in and you cannot move out. The only way you can move, and like you said, Salvador, was that you have to be able to pull equity out of your house to put a down payment on the next step up to a better house. But if that property is not gaining any equity, then you're pretty much locked into that house. And then again, you can't improve it. You can't.
Right.
You're working just to pay the mortgage.
But no, it's not impossible anymore, because we've passed laws to fix the problem for black people to get loans, right?
Nah.
I mean, we set up a system, and the way I look at it is we've had 400 years of slavery, and then how many years of
100 years of Jim Crow.
yeah, and you know, we're slowly moving out of that, but a 600 year or 500 years of a society deciding it's going to be one way, we're not going to change that overnight.
No.
And yeah, I mean, and the problem is we're not changing it at all. We're still doing the exact same things. We talked about. I don't want to steal your thunder
No, go
about
ahead. Go ahead, Salvatore.
the which bank was it?
Bancorp South. I'm
Bancorp
holding
South.
the article right here. Yeah.
A month ago. Go ahead. I'll
Okay, yeah.
let you. You're the host. I'll let you do
Oh
it.
no! This is your guy's show. Mostly it's Bobby's show, but
Definitely.
We're just here to keep him talking. That doesn't take much effort, really. He's not going to run out of things on this topic, I'm sure. But anyway, yeah, I mean, a lot of people, Bobby, would think, well, okay, we've got laws against that now. That doesn't happen. But I know that from buying a house in Baton Rouge, that code words are used with the realtors to let you know this is a black neighborhood, but they can't say that.
Mm-hmm.
But they can let you know that, that kind of thing. But here, the Clarion Ledger in South Mississippi, June 30th of this year, states that the Department of Justice and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau fined Mississippi-based Bancorp South $10.6 million, alleging that they deliberately discriminated against minorities in its lending practices. Now, they were never convicted because they settled out of court and didn't admit any guilt. However, the evidence, was overwhelming according to this year. They said that during this period, let me see here, there was 22 branches in the Memphis area between 2011 and 2013, all of which were located outside the neighborhoods. And the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, found that there were huge disparities between not only the racial profiles of the people they loaned to, far more whites than blacks, but also they tended to charge a higher interest rate to the black people.
Mm-hmm.
So that was what I was coming to yesterday. You can get loans, yeah, but then they jack them up.
Well, I know from experience. Last time I bought a car, the dealer's like, "Well, we can give you, it was what I thought it was a bad rate. It was like 5 or 6% on a car, and I looked at him like, I'm not paying 5 or 6% on a car. So I went and found to the bank and got 3.5%, and then I started talking to my friends about what their rates were, and I'm like, 25% on a car loan, things like that. To me is, and a cars don't appreciate. So yeah, it happens.
One thing about redlining that's often overlooked, I think we in the South get blamed for being so backwards and racist.
Thank you.
But redlining ensured that segregation would be coast to coast, north to south.
You can go online and find maps for San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, any northern city you want. You can go find it. It is not a southern thing.
Yes, some of the studies I found, in fact, the first ones that came up when I Googled the topic, the studies came out of Boston in Massachusetts and Seattle, Washington.
Yeah.
But, and it was commonplace. I mean, all of the things, the whole litany of the discrimination. By the way, you're listening to A Pause for Thought with Wayne Parker, Salvatore, and Bobby Thompson here on WHYR Radio, 96.9 FM in Baton Rouge. We're discussing redlining. And, yeah, they also, oops, somebody's phone is still on, and that's my elect. Anyway.
Not me.
Okay. Bobby.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
I'm looking at here. This is relating to the redlining, I suppose, but you could probably tell me better. This is from the same article I started with, the racist housing policy that made your neighborhood, talking about redlining and all that. It says, black people with upper middle class incomes do not generally live in upper middle class neighborhoods. Research shows that black families making $100,000 typically live in the kinds of neighborhoods inhabited by white families making $30,000. And there's a quote here by the guy who did the study. It says, blacks and whites inhabit such different neighborhoods that it is not possible to compare the economic outcomes of black and white children. But why is that? Why aren't blacks living in upper middle class neighborhoods if they have them?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I would say this. Looking at the legacy of the Red Line and the contract loans, black people want to make sure they can make those payments, and so they probably live in and along with what neighborhoods are they going to be comfortable living in,
Right.
given the racial influences on the society. One thing, the legacy of redlining is going to be with us for a long time, because of the way the neighborhoods are established. It's going to take. There are integrated neighborhoods that I'm using that term integrated very loosely, that have black people living, and I can think of a few here in Baton Rouge. But we have ghettos here. I was a letter carrier for 17 years in North Baton Rouge, and I literally watched that neighborhood go from an integrated neighborhood to about 90% black in those 17 years, and watched the businesses and the infrastructure and the restaurants and everything just leave that area and left the people with practically nothing. And you drive down there that way now, and it's like, as far as economic value, it's like a ghost town. There's no business operating, say from Memorial Stadium to all the way to Skylandville. Well, to Choctaw was my area, so I was familiar with that. And that's just west of where Alton Sterling was killed. So I know those neighborhoods, and I know how trapped those people are because of the way the mortgage system was set up.
Sure, and as far as the legacy and how that affects the outlook of an entire race of people in America, an entire race of Americans.
Absolutely, and Salvador hit on it as far as inheritance. What happens is, by the time the houses are ready to be passed on, they're practically worthless. Right. And so nobody really wants it, or there's tax to be paid on it that who's going to put good money to bad. And so you end up with vacant homes. You end up with a neighborhood with what we call blight.
Yeah.
To where when the older people die out, the houses just sit vacant.
Yeah, and I've driven through parts of North Baton Rouge, I have to admit, only since Alton Sterling was killed, and I finally decided to get involved in trying to find a solution. But I found or passed lots of really nice, well-maintained, good-looking homes. Mm-hmm. And just right next door, there'd be one that's all boarded up or collapsing in on itself. And all I could think of was the people that own the nice-looking home are just desperately hanging on to keep what little bit they can keep. But then, with the decline in utilities and poor road maintenance and things like that, I mean, there are things beyond their control as far as the value of their home.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And everybody who can leave has. I mean, they're gonna, you're gonna move to Ascension. You're gonna move to where the schools are better. If you have the ability and wherewithal to get out of those neighborhoods, you are, and I can't blame them for that. Mm-hmm. But it's set up a concentration of despair right there.
Right.
And
so right.
Exactly.
And I wonder if that's part of the reason why, there's so much crime. Of course, there's drugs and everything else, but there's got to be a lot of despair there.
Absolutely. Like I said, Chicago is a good look at the way the rest of the country has turned out. And if you look at those neighborhoods that were redlined, that were where black people were forced to live in, they have become the most violent, the most drug and gang infested, because once you herd people into a no-win situation,
they begin to consume themselves, basically.
And I think that's kind of the real legacy of redlining. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
And one of the guys, I'm sorry, I lost my thought.
Well, I think that's one of the real legacies of redlining, is you create pockets and concentrations of poverty. When the restrictions ended, is one thing that was brought up in the roundtable. I know we're coming up on
We're doing good. I'm watching.
All right. The people who could leave did. Mm-hmm. and that left this distillate of despair of people who were trapped, who couldn't leave, in areas with bad roads, with food deserts, with poor schools, and we're dealing with that now.
Okay, one last point, Bobby. We got to go.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. One father was saying that he realized that his kids began to believe that's where they belong.
Right. Yes,
so
and that's
sad.
yes, and that's anyway. It's one for another show, and I hope we have many more, Bobby. You've been listening to A Pause for Thought with Wayne Parker and my co-host Salvatore, and our special and very gracious guest Bobby Thompson, talking about redlining, and we intend to have more shows on these topics in the future. Thank you for listening.
With the help of folks like Sarah. Thanks for joining us today.